Now available in paperback and e-readers, E-Steam Ascension, The Devil's Diva reaches a turning point in her life with this powerful E-Steam series story. Get E-Steam Ascension at online booksellers today. I was on Facebook doing my weekend promotion when I got the news that legendary comic book artist George Perez had passed away. Now, Mr. Perez passed away today at 67 years old due to inoperable pancreatic cancer that he had been diagnosed with earlier last year. And Mr. Perez sadly was not able to go on the farewell tour that he had planned and reconnect with comic fans. He was planning on trying to make his last year of life one where he could go out here and spend time with fans. Unfortunately, God had other plans for Mr. Perez. And I'm really sorry to hear about Mr. Perez's passing because I know how much he loved comic fans and how much he loved the comic book medium. And it takes a lot of love to go out here and want to go out here and share with people in the comic book community, even as you are in the last days of your life. And that just shows how much heart George Perez had for everyone and how much love he wanted to share with everyone. And I really will miss George Perez because he truly was a great person from what I've heard and from what I've seen in his actions. He has shown that he had legendary character, just like the legendary art that he produced over the last 40 years. And George Perez is an artist who will have a lasting legacy on the comic book medium, and he will be someone who will ever forever be remembered as one of the great masters of the craft of comic book art. Now, your George Perez made great contributions to the comic book medium over the course of his career that went on for, I believe, over 40 years, and he made a great and significant contribution to the medium of comics with his distinctive art style. Now, your George Perez, like the late Neil Adams, created a very photorealistic style that basically turned comic book art into something that looked just like a photograph, and his singular images were filled with so much detail you basically felt like you were looking at a photograph, and you were looking at a photograph from something out of something like Time or Life magazine. That's how powerful the visuals George Perez had in comics were. And whenever you looked at a George Perez comic, you weren't just looking at a comic book. No, you were in for an experience as related to comic books. So when you picked up a George Perez comic book, you were not just getting some generic art, you were getting pictures that were bigger, larger, and grander than life, and his images and visuals were so big and epic, you basically felt like you were seeing shots that were coming out of a big budget action movie. That's what made a George Perez comic an experience, and whenever you looked at some of his artwork, it just basically exploded off the page and felt like you were again immersed inside of a big budget action movie. And that was the signature staple of George Perez art, was the amount of incredible detail that Mr. Perez put into his pieces. And when you looked at George Perez's art, everything from the smallest shard of glass from a fight scene or the pieces of metal that were broken off in a fight, all of these details were basically rendered down to the smallest pieces, and all of it came together in a visual that was so powerful that it just basically drew you into whatever story he was doing the art for. And George Perez's whole portfolio of art is basically every major character at Marvel Comics and DC Comics, and he has had numerous storied runs on some of the greatest comics in comic history. Now, when I was a little boy, I learned how to read from George Perez's Avengers run. And when I was a little boy, I didn't think much of that art when I was about 5 or 6 years old. But as I grew older, I began to really appreciate the art in George Perez's comics. And as my brother started sharing more of those comics with me, I started to see many of his great runs, like his Justice League run from the 70s, his New Teen Titans run from the 80s, his Fantastic Four run from the late 70s, and his run of books like his X-Men annual. And I also got to look at many of his other great titles, like some of his later DC work on Superman. I was able to go out here and experience all of these great books because they were a part of my brother's collection. And as I became a teenager, I began to experience more of George's great work, such as Batman, A Lonely Place of Dying's just beautiful covers, and again, some of those Superman books he did in the late 80s. And I was also able to go out here and pick up the Infinity Gauntlet, the trade paperback. I did get one of the issues, but one of the things that I am really thanking God I was blessed to do was actually be able to experience George Perez's art as it was originally published, and actually even pick up some of his books straight off the newsstand and straight out of the comic shop. I mean, whenever George Perez was announced for a title, it was something that every comic fan basically built their schedule around. And I remember back in the 80s when everybody said George Perez was getting ready to do some work on a book, that's when people started putting their money aside to go pick up that book. And I remember in '89 when I heard that he was going out here to do the covers for A Lonely Place of Dying, I was putting money away to get those books months in advance. And whenever you hear George Perez is on a book, you just drop whatever money you had for whatever you wanted, and you were going to go pick those books up, because you were not just going to get a comic from George Perez, you were going to get an experience as related to whatever books he was on. And that's what made him a legendary comic book artist. But what also made George Perez a truly great person was the way he treated many comic fans at Comic Cons. Now, sadly, I never got a chance to meet George Perez in person. I would have loved to have met him in real life, but I have never had enough money to go to a Comic Con back in the 90s. But I've heard from other people how he was a statesman for the medium, and how he was always being diplomatic and very graceful and kind to comic fans, whether he was just doing a signing, doing sketches, or going out here and doing commissions for people. He always treated everybody with the utmost of respect, I've heard, and I could see how great character he had when he went out here and said that even during a COVID-19 pandemic and him suffering from inoperable cancer, he was still willing to take some time out of the last year of his life, because the diagnosis was they gave him a year to live, and he was willing to take time out of his life in his last days to share it with fans. And again, that is a great love to have for comic fans, and it's a great love for the business. And again, it takes a man with great heart to go out here and put himself out here in his last days for people. And I really am, again, really saddened to hear about George Perez's passing, because the comic book industry lost one of not only its greatest artists, but I believe we lost one of our great statesmen today, and we lost a man who had made great contributions to this comic book medium. And he's somebody who I believe will greatly be missed, because when I look at George Perez, he not only produced beautiful art, but he also was a beautiful person. And we really are going to miss a great legend like this and a great icon. And he has left a great legacy in comics, because your George Perez, not only, again, was he a great artist, he was a great person. And I will always be grateful for the opportunity as a child that I learned how to read from his comics at a young age. And I'm always grateful for all of the great art and the great stories he produced. And I really thank God I was blessed to actually experience his art in its original form. And I was blessed to actually experience his art as it was originally published, and actually have the actual comics in my hand. That is something that most generations will not really appreciate, the whole ability to hold a actual George Perez comic in their hands and actually experience his art as it was originally done. I mean, that is something that, again, I thank God I was blessed to experience. And I really think he was, again, one of the all-time great artists. And I'm deeply saddened to hear about his passing, because right now we have lost two of what I call the great masters of the comic book medium. Sadly, we lost Neil Adams last week, and we've lost George Perez. And it's sad that we've lost two of the great masters of the comic book medium. And I really am saddened, because, George Perez was a major part of my life. I mean, his Avengers run came along when I was a little boy, and I read those comics. New Teen Titans was being published when I was a kid. Crisis of Infinite Earths. I mean, so many books. Lonely Place of Dying, the Superman books with Maxima. So many, Infinity Gauntlet, so many of these books were a major part of my childhood and teen years, and I'm really saddened to hear about the passing of one of the great masters, George Perez, and I'm sad to hear that he passed away today, and my condolences go to his family. And I want to again thank George Perez once again for all of the great memories as related to comics, and all of the great art that he produced, and truly being a great statesman to this medium. Thank you, George Perez, for everything you have done for comics, and I hope you rest in power. Now available in paperback and e-readers, E-Steam Blast from the Past. Hell's aspiring angel takes on her demonic doppelganger in this action-packed, time-traveling E-Steam series adventure. Get E-Steam Blast from the Past with a bonus E-Steam comic book, No Good Deed, in paperback and e-readers at online booksellers everywhere.